Welcome to our final chapter of BPK 143, chapter 19, and this is on strength and power training for performance. Now, we need to keep in mind still that people interested in preparing to perform do not have to be elite. They could be competing at any level in any sport, or perhaps performing daily physical tasks at work, such as police officers, firefighters, being in the military. So in this chapter, we'll collectively refer to this type of person as an athlete. So let's get started with the introduction. Muscular strength and muscular power underpin many qualities for sport performance. We know that muscular strength is the ability to apply force. Training for strength uses concentric, so where the muscle is shortening, and eccentric, where the muscle is lengthening, and isometric, where the muscle is not changing length. All of those muscle actions. Power is the rate of applying the force. Power training is used to cause an increased speed of movements and explosiveness in muscles generating a force. And power exercises target the coordination of muscle actions across multiple joints. And they do so to become faster, smoother, and more efficient. So let's go back to our training principles, and specifically the principles of overload and specificity. So the intensity metrics of overload will be expanded upon again in this chapter beyond what you already learned in the text. An exercise prescription for overload in strength and power development could include range of motion, intensity. So what you know about intensity right now, this could be a percentage of 1 rep max. It can also include frequency and or duration, or the volume. It is also an overload to increase the technical requirements. So this is really a key part of this chapter. We want to think about challenging the nervous system or our balances. So the technical requirements of the exercises performed with the intent to challenge the nervous system beyond what has been previously exposed to. Born out of that is the transfer of training effect, and this is the degree to which a training exercise promotes adaptation in performance. We also want to maximize the potential for transfer of training effects. A training exercise, to do that, a training exercise must use reasonable levels of movement, pattern specificity, and overload. So this is why at this point we've paired these two principles together. So let's say you were doing running, and you're doing running for a purpose, such as improving speed in soccer. The movement pattern itself of running is specific to soccer, but the overload, however, might not be present if the individual isn't hitting their max velocity, or at least a similar velocity to what they would reach during a soccer match. So again, we want to consider both our overload and the specificity. It's really important when we are doing advanced training for athletes and performance-minded clients that we look at the demands of their sport. So we'll give an example. It wouldn't make much sense for an American football player, an NFL player, to run long distances in their off season, or conversely a tennis player to do their interval training in the swimming pool. So appreciating the sport's attributes and its components of fitness that need to be developed will help you make better programming decisions when you're working with a performance-minded client. So we need to consider the attributes of the sport before we can implement a program. And these attributes can include common movement patterns and muscular involvement, types of muscle actions, the regions of force production most emphasized in the movements. And you can see in this image with the football player, you can see his knee flexion and hip inflection. And you can look at the back leg and you can see where his back leg is pushing off and producing that force. It also includes ballistic, including explosive or elastic, versus non-ballistic or static, stabilizing, and slow movements. So a wrestler, for example, might need to produce force more statically compared to a defensive back in football that would need to produce force more ballistically. We also want to consider common sites of joint and muscle injury. So we might need to do some training to try and make those areas stronger or more resistant to injury. So we looked at the sports, and what should we do now? Well, we should look at the athlete or the fitness participant next, and we would do a physical testing battery, and this is similar to what you learned back in Chapter 8. So we'd want to specifically look at assessments of the client's strength, power, speed, and endurance. Those are all very important qualities. It is also important to know an athlete's training status and their training age. So how much experience they have with training would be their training age. And that's what we refer to in point 3. Training age is their training experience and background, and it relates to their starting point. For example, you might want to uncover what type of training they have experience with, what was their length of participation in previous programs, and what was their level of intensity, and what is their degree of proficiency with performing resistance training exercises. So we could safely assume a novice is not proficient, but someone that has had a coach before may have some level of proficiency, or maybe they have some bad habits. So all in all, it's important to get a picture of where the athlete currently is and what experience they have. So the next thing we do after we've assessed the athletes is we classify them. Because, as I mentioned, we can classify them as a novice, an intermediate, or advanced. So novice lifters are defined as untrained individuals with no resistance training experience, or individuals who have not trained for several years. So they might have had some training experience many years back, but they've been inactive for a long time, so we would still consider them novice. They really need to learn how to lift, thus mastering the fundamental movement patterns, same as our general population novice, as well as develop a general foundation of strength and some hypertrophy. Training for these individuals can be performed 2 or 3 days per week. Some sources recommend for boys and girls over 17 years of age to perform 5 repetition sets. Other sources recommend 8 to 10 reps per set. The bottom line is you want to instill very good habits. So whatever rep range you choose, they should have very good form. Essentially, the intensity, loading, and volume should all be low enough that they're not sacrificing technique and that quality work can be accomplished. And technique will determine the results at this stage of learning and training. There's also a good chance that a novice trainer has not been strength tested before, and therefore percent 1 rep max loads might not be the best way to prescribe their training. Progress training session to training session in a linear pattern. So what does this mean? Well, it just means that you progress as you go, and we'll look at some of the progressions as we go through this lecture and throughout chapter 19. And it's probably a good idea for a novice to not do too many exercises. So as you can see in this table, table 19.1, there are 3 main exercises: our squat, bench press, chin-ups, plus assistance exercises. So you may only have 2 or 3 assistance exercises for a total of 5 or 6 different exercises on each training day. That's probably plenty for a novice to make sure they are doing the exercises correctly. Let's look at the intermediate lifter now. So intermediate lifters have 6 months of consistent, structured resistance training experience. And this is a pretty rough guidelines. Intermediates in general also require a more structured unloading period as compared to the novice, so structured rest periods. Intermediate lifters require more training variety in the way the primary exercises are applied, such as moving from a back squat to a front squat. So they might do a block of training where they're working on their back squat or their front squat, or they might have 3 different workouts where one day is volume day, one day is a recovery day, and one day is an intensity day. And that's what we see here in table 19.2. So it's really up to you as the coach to determine what is best for the intermediate lifter. The intermediate lifter also needs a greater stress, more sets, and higher intensity or percentage of 1 rep max, but they also need more rest, and their improvements are going to be slower. Now, intermediates are certainly more ready for more complex parallel approach, which means they can handle doing other forms of training and work on multiple fitness components simultaneously. In this case, the training priorities must be set, and there must be easier days and harder days in terms of volume low. So as you can see in table 19.2, there is variation in volume load. There are easier days and there are harder days. All of the percentages in this table are represented as a percent 1 rep max. So we're going to assume that these athletes have had their lifts tested. So our 80% that's listed here on our volume day, that's 80% of their 1 rep max. This is just one example of many different ways in which we could alter volume load, and volume load is going to be discussed further later on in the chapter. So let's look at our advanced lifter now. And advanced lifters should have at least 1 year of structured resistance training experience, and they will benefit from more variety in their training. They don't require a lengthy general preparation phase, and they can work at even higher intensity, so greater than 85% of their 1 rep max. The client is highly proficient in movements related to their exercise routine. And in table 19.3 that we see below, all the percentages are represented as a percent 1 rep max. And our 85% again represents 85% of their 1 rep max. So we can see, again, this is a higher intensity for our advanced lifter compared to what we saw with our intermediate or novice lifters. Now let's look at our exercise selection. We just finished classifying our athletes. So exercises can be classified as primary, which recruits 1 or more large muscle groups and are multi-joint, or assistance exercises, and these usually recruit smaller muscle areas and involve only 1 joint. So this is really important because it is the primary exercises that we are trying to quantify when we're trying to monitor the amount of stress that we are putting on the individual. So to build on this classification, an exercise that loads the spine directly is also termed structural. So we're adding this term structural. Can you think of any exercises that load the spine directly? And hopefully one of the first ones that jumps into mind is squats, because we're definitely going to load the spine when we're doing a squat, when we have the bar on our back. And these exercises, structural exercises, involve muscular stabilization of posture during the performance of the lifts. Most strength and power programs for performance include structural exercises, such as our squats, such as I just mentioned, as well as deadlifts, presses, and pulls. What about training frequency? So let's have a look now at our FIT acronym. You see in the chart here, we have training status on the left and training frequency on the right. Generally, the number of training sessions per week will likely exceed 7 sessions or 7 different workouts, but they would be different workouts. I'm not saying that all 7 are going to be strength workouts. The individual that you're training could be, if they are a performance-minded client, they could be doing other things. They might be going to practice, they might be doing skill work, things like that. So we need to consider that. We all need to consider the athlete's training status, what part of their season they're in, and the corresponding loads, as well as any other concurrent training they're doing, such as practice, as we mentioned, any high intensity interval training that they're doing. So we can't just say that an advanced client should be doing 7 days of strength training, because if they are doing other things, that would be way too much to be doing those other things as well as 7 days of strength training. And so that's why you see such big ranges here. These ranges aren't set in stone. And these guidelines come from our National Strength and Conditioning Association. It's probably optimal, if you're training high intensity, to schedule 1 recovery day between resistance training sessions that stress the same muscle groups or at the same level of intensity. So let's say on Monday you squatted at 80%. It's probably a good idea for you to do something different on Tuesday before you squat at 80% again on Wednesday. And in some cases you might need 72 hours of recovery. Split routines can be used with athletes who want to train more often or have to reduce the duration of their training sessions. So let's imagine you wanted to train 4 days per week. That doesn't always allow for a rest day between every session. So you might do upper body 1 day and lower body the next, take a day off, and then go back to upper body and lower body again. What I do need to mention, though, is that split routines do not develop the coordination or neural adaptations that a full body workout does. So if coordination is a goal or power production is a goal, it's probably not the best bet. But if hypertrophy is a goal, it's not a bad idea to do a split routine. So again, it depends on the goal of the athlete. Reduced frequency when in-season competing or an individual is performing in their chosen activity. More advanced athletes often train with maximal or near maximal loads, and knowing this, increasing training frequency without assigning lower intensity days is not a good idea. So it is actually possible to do back-to-back days of resistance training if you're training with high intensity, but the second session would have to be very low intensity. So back-to-back high intensity days is not a great idea. It's a quick pathway to injury fatigue and possibly overtraining syndrome. So here's an example. Having an athlete sprint maximally on Monday and then lift maximally on Tuesday and going back to maximally sprinting again on Wednesday. If you did that, it really does not demonstrate any undulations in the loading, meaning all 3 days are considered high intensity. So what would be the solution? We could do 2 sessions in one day and take the next day off. So let's say the athlete did sprinting in the morning, lifted in the evening, then took Tuesday off, did some mobility work, some recovery in the pool on the Tuesday, and then on Wednesday went back to sprinting in the morning and lifting in the evening. In the textbook, they give an abbreviation, SSS or S cubed. The first S stands for speed. So if you're going to do more than one workout in the day, the first workout will be speed. The second S stands for sport or practice. So if you had to go to practice, you would do that after your speed training. And then the third S stands for strength. So strength training would be the last thing you do that day. So if an athlete has a sprints or speed session, a sport practice, and a strength session in the same day, the order suggested is ideal from both a performance and recovery standpoint. So ideally, the athlete would have a few hours between each workout as well, so they can rest and refuel. Well, let's look at intensity now. The relative intensity or percent 1 rep max is more commonly used in intermediate and advanced strength trained individuals. And relative intensity is something that you've learned about in the text already. It is the percent 1 rep max. Exercise intensity in strength exercises is expressed simply as the load, so the number of kilograms or pounds lifted. So if I said I wanted you to go to the gym and lift 100 pounds, that would be the exercise intensity. Notice it's not a percentage, so it's important that you recognize the difference between our relative intensity and our exercise intensity. Intensity in power exercises is expressed in watts, and peak power is the product of force and velocity. So remember, power equals force times velocity. The precise percentage 1 rep max, or relative intensity, where peak power occurs, can be determined with specific technology. So something like a Tendo unit or GymAware or push device. And it depends on several factors. It depends on whether the exercise involves single or multiple joints. Depends on whether the body mass is also involved in the movement. So if I'm holding onto dumbbells and jumping onto a table, I'm not only lifting the weight of the dumbbells, I'm also lifting my own mass. So that has to be considered as well. Also needs to be considered whether or not the movement goes through a large range of motion, i.e. a deep squat, and I jumped out of that position, or even a quarter squat, or a small range of motion. So thinking skipping rope. So sometimes it's hard to say where the percent rep max or where peak power occurs because of those 3 factors. And then the 4th factor is whether the movement is ballistic or non-ballistic. So let's examine those terms. What is meant by ballistic? Well, ballistic movements are those in which motion results from an initial impulse, i.e. a push into the ground, from a muscular contraction followed by the relaxation of the muscle. So essentially, the motion of the body, like in a jump, and or the barbell, like during a clean exercise, continues as a result of the momentum. And remember, the momentum was created by the motion of the body. So it possesses momentum from the applied impulse. And this is our impulse momentum relationship. This is part of the ballistic side of muscle actions. Now, to contrast ballistic is non-ballistic. And non-ballistic movements are where the muscular contraction is relatively constant throughout the movement, and there is no impulse used to generate momentum within the movement. So to give you some examples, a ballistic movement would be a jump, whereas a non-ballistic would be a barbell back squat. So determining where peak power occurs also depends on whether the movement is ballistic or non-ballistic. And now we're going to talk about peak power. And let's go back to those terms, non-ballistics. So for whole body non-ballistic movements, peak power occurs at approximately 40 to 60% of 1 rep max. So if you're doing a standing military press or squat, it's around that 40 to 60% of 1 rep max if we were to measure it. Now for semi-ballistic movement, like a clean, peak power occurs at around 70 to 85% of 1 rep max. So you can see if your goal is to improve power, you need to prescribe a little bit heavier for semi-ballistic movement, such as cleans. So our power cleans, full clean, hang clean, the snatch, power snatch, and the jerk. Optimum loading for jumping and sprinting movements, which are also classified as ballistic, can be targeted using force velocity profiling, and we'll be discussing that later. And generally, it is between 0 and 40% of 1 rep max, because you're not using any external load, so generally it's not very heavy. So let's now look at exercise efforts, and it's something we didn't talk about earlier in the textbook, but we're introducing it now. The exercise efforts, as you know, is usually represented by the RPE, which is our rating of perceived exertion scale, and it is a feeling of how hard something is. It is how close we are to failure or proximity to failure. It is about perceived efforts, and it can change day to day based on the readiness of the athlete. So it can change based on how well our athlete is recovering, and we call this readiness. Training density is another key term, and this is the frequency of training per session, per day, per week. For example, if week 1 of a mesocycle contains 10 training sessions and week 2 contains 5, we can state that week 1 has a higher density. So this is important to note. This is so we can keep track of things in our program. And we're going to look at another training variable, in this case training volume. It's a measure of the total work performed. Although relative intensity can be computed by the amount of weight lifted, the overall training volume also combines the number of repetitions and sets per exercise, which is related to intensity, the number and types of exercises used, and the frequency with which these exercises are repeated. So are they repeated once per week, twice per week, 3 times per week? So training volume is always about total work. Now let's look at an approach that is called volume load. And this approach is useful in quantifying the nature of the load for the primary exercises and comparing these loads week to week and month to month. Planning and tracking alterations by volume load can be more valuable than just tracking alterations in intensity. And it can also help delineate between a hypertrophy program, a maximum strength program, or a power-based program. And it can help identify periods of high training volumes and periods of reduced volumes, such as a taper, where we reduce the volume right before a major event. And this approach works well provided there are no major changes in exercises. So if we were constantly changing our exercises, it's a little more difficult to monitor our volume load. So let's not think of training volume independent of intensity and vice versa. It is the interaction of the two, and that's what promotes adaptations or creates situations of overtraining. And we'll go over just a basic calculation of volume load in a strength or power resistance training program. So we can calculate it by summing the product of the load and the number of repetitions for each set. So it's a repetitions number times the external load. So our example, if an athlete does back squats of 200 kilograms for 3 reps and 4 sets of that, the volume load would be calculated as 200 kilograms times the 3 reps and then multiplying by the 4 sets, giving us 2,400 kilograms. So the volume load for that primary exercise, the back squats, is 2,400 kilograms. Now, if we did the same prescription for the bench press, for example, we would get another 2,400 kilograms of training volume load. And if we added those two together, if it was just the 2 exercises, our back squats and our bench press, then the total volume load of the workout would be 4,800 kilograms. Now, remember, we only do volume load calculations with our primary exercises. So if there were bicep curls or crunches or planks or bridges in the workout, we wouldn't add them up and take them into consideration. We're just measuring progress and volume loads with our primary exercises. Now, earlier in the book, we learned about 1 rep max tables, and there's a table in chapter 5, table 5.1, that shows this idea of 1 rep max and using 1 rep max to prescribe intensity. However, it is important to note the limitations, and the limitations are such that the loads that we lift and the reps that you perform, they don't work in a linear fashion, especially because 1 rep max is related to the first sets, and if you're doing multiple sets, there is going to be fatigue. There are differences between highly trained athletes and lesser trained athletes. And the irony here is that highly trained athletes may fatigue sooner simply due to their adapted ability to recruit more motor units for a given load. It also does not account for multiple set programming and is based on a single set. So we already said this, we're just reiterating it. It is only accurate when the athlete performs fewer than 10 repetitions. As the percentage of 1 rep decreases, the variability in the number of repetitions that can be completed will increase. True 1 rep max testing can only be conducted on trained athletes who have experience with the exercises, have very good technique, and have been exposed to maximal efforts in the past. So it doesn't really seem to be a very feasible method of prescribing intensity, does it? And it does work with highly trained individuals, and it can be effective as long as we are aware of the limits. But what if our client doesn't have any 1 rep max data? What do we do then? Well, we might use something called the reps in reserve approach. And this approach is beneficial because it allows for the client's subjective feeling of fatigue. Because every day we're going to feel a little bit different when we're training. And this means it takes into account those fluctuations in readiness and arousal levels that clients will feel from day to day. It also prevents the athletes from being too focused on hitting target numbers and ignoring how their body is responding to the training stress that day. So notice in our table 19.5 that 10 is maximal and an 8 indicates that they feel like they'd have 2 to 4 reps left if they continued. So we use this modified scale and we use it to prescribe resistance training intensities for the more advanced client when we try to educate them. We also need to note the scale starts at 5 with warm-up weights, and most strength prescriptions will lie around an 8, 9, or 10. So you understand the written prescription. In a written prescription, we might ask a client to perform 3 sets of 5 with 2 reps in reserve. So it'd be written as 3 times 5 with 2 RIR, and that means there's 2 reps in reserve. So this is essentially an RPE scale, rating perceived exertion scale, and it's the reps in reserve that we use when we're prescribing exercise. So we'll pause here, and then we'll begin our next video talking about methods of strength and power development.